Lesson 94, Using Context to Translate Third-Person Verbs. Catherine, so far we have devoted quite a bit of attention to the translation of third-person verbs because sometimes we need to use the pronoun that is embedded in a third-person verb.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we don't. Sometimes there's a person's name that is a separate word serving as the subject of the sentence. Sometimes there's another noun like a cat or a horse. And then sometimes we don't have any other word to be the subject. And so we have to make use of the pronoun that is embedded or included in the verb itself. And so for beginners, this can be a difficult thing. I remember when I was learning Latin for the first time in high school, I didn't fully catch on to when you're supposed to use the pronoun in the verb and when you're not supposed to. Latin is very similar structurally to Greek.
Right.
And so when I wrote my book, Getting Started with Latin, which is a beginning Latin book, I made kind of a big deal out of that. I made sure to explain when to use the pronoun and when not to.
Yeah.
And I think that's helpful for beginners. And so we're continuing that theme here. And here's the reason why, is because now that we know the word because, that is hoti, now we can have sentences with two parts. And so one part of a sentence can provide context that's useful for translating the other part of the sentence.
Exactly.
So if you read one part of the sentence and it talks about somebody, you might keep that same somebody in mind as you translate the second part of the sentence. And even if the second part of the sentence doesn't explicitly mention whoever it was, you still kind of can tell that it's still talking about that person or talking about that thing or animal. And so the idea here is context. We can sort of feel out what's happening as we read through a sentence that could have multiple parts. So let's talk through an example sentence and let's see how one part of a sentence could provide some context that helps us understand another part of a sentence. So, Catherine, in our first example sentence, we have just a normal sentence. I sleep often because I am a cat. It's a clear sentence. There's no difficulty translating it. It just says, Polakis katheudo, I sleep often, hoti, because, and then ailurosemi, I am a cat. It's pretty straightforward and simple, but in ancient Greek, it's not always going to be that simple. We may have a sentence in which it's not 100% clear who a certain verb is talking about or referring to. And we're going to see this, I think, most often with third-person verbs because they can refer to several different parties. So take us through the second example sentence, the one that starts with Alexandros. Take us through this sentence and help us see how one part of the sentence may shed light on another part of the sentence and help us to get a feeling of clarity for who the verb is referring to. How can we put all that together and have context that helps us translate?
So Alexandros Polakis katheude hoti ailurosestin has two parts. The Alexandros Polakis katheude it could be its own complete sentence without anything else. And then ailurosestin also could be its own complete sentence, but they're joined by hoti. Now, the first part has a subject that's very clear, Alexandros, and he's the subject of the verb katheude. But in the second part of the sentence, ailurosestin, that's where the confusion can arise, because ailuros could look like the subject of estin. It's not, and the reason why we know it's not is because this phrase is joined to the rest of the sentence, and the subject of the rest of the sentence is Alexandros. So what hoti does is it gives us a clue that the part of the sentence with Alexandros is related to the part of the sentence with ailurosestin.
So, Catherine, the first part of the sentence is pretty clear.
Right.
Alexandros Polakis katheude. There's nothing unclear about that. It's just Alexander sleeps often.
Right.
We know exactly who the subject is. We know what the verb is telling us. We know what the subject is doing. We have an adverb tells us how often it's happening. But then the second part, ailu rosestin, that's the part that has less clarity.
Right. Because there's a question about where the subject is.
Because within that part of the sentence, there is no explicit subject stated.
Right.
So as a translator, we need to figure out who is estin referring to. It could mean he is, she is, or it is. Who is it referring to? So that's the clarity we need to clear up. And I think the first part of the sentence can help us with that. So how can we use the first part of the sentence to help ourselves understand the second part of the sentence?
So in a Greek sentence, generally the subject will not change between parts of the sentence unless it's explicitly changed, and there'll be huge markings and highlights and all that that'll show you. So what we can do is hold Alexandros from the first part of the sentence and just keep it in mind until we get to ailu rosestin. And since Alexandros is the subject, then that clues us into the fact that estin probably needs a he is for translating. So Alexandros sleeps often because he is, she is, it is. Oh, Alexandros, Alexander, is masculine. So what we need is he is a cat. So Alexander sleeps often because he is a cat.
So when we read the first part of the sentence, we know it's talking about Alexandros. And then in the second part of the sentence, when we see the verb estin talking about he is, she is, or it is, based on the context from the first part of the sentence, we know the sentence is talking about Alexandros. So we just mentally, we know that in the second part of the sentence, it's probably talking about him there too.
Mm-hmm.
So the he is in estin is referring to Alexandros. So when we say he is a cat, we know it's saying that because Alexander is a cat.
Right.
It wouldn't make any sense to translate it as she is a cat because we know it's referring to Alexander, or it is a cat. I suppose we could do that, but
it sounds weird.
Yeah, but with Alexander there, it's probably better to say he is a cat. So when we're deciding how to translate estin to say, he is, or she is, or it is, we can look at the context and see that in the first part of the sentence, it's already talking about Alexander. So we just continue to see the sentence as continuing to refer to Alexander. And then when we get to estin, we'll translate it as he is, knowing that it's referring back to Alexander.
Exactly.
So in this fashion, the first part of the sentence can shed light on the remaining parts of the sentence and tell us the context of who is being referred to. And so, Catherine, this is a pretty simple example, but I think there's a valuable concept here for our listeners to take with them. And that is the idea of using one part of a sentence to help you interpret the other parts. Because as Greek gets more complicated, as they start to read more complex sentences, this is really going to become even more important to see how the different parts of the sentence connect to each other.
And it also continues even after they get to the point where they're reading more than one sentence in a row that is connected. So when they're reading whole paragraphs, because usually Greek will keep the same subject for multiple sentences until it signals to you, okay, we're changing subject now.
So if you read a sentence that's talking about one party, a man, a woman, a place, an animal, whatever, sometimes you have to hold that in mind as the thing that they're continuing to refer to over the next couple of sentences.
Yes, and it's very important to do that.
So you have to just park that in the back of your mind and continue to view that as the party that's being referred to. And so that's the skill we're teaching you here. In the first part of the sentence, you have Alexander, and then you hold that in mind and you use that again. You sort of reuse that as the subject again in the second part. And so estin means he is because it's referring to the previously stated, Alexander. So this is a good skill to have, to be able to sort of hold one thing in mind while you move on to other things, to give you sort of a composite understanding of what's happening. So this is a good skill to have. When you get to a less specific part of a Greek sentence, and this happens all the time in Greek, when you get to a part of a sentence that's less specific and less explicitly stating what's going on, you have to really pay attention to the context to know who is being referred to.